"Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," announced Richard Blackwood, the manager of the Golden Table restaurant, his voice dripping with barely concealed disgust as he stared at my wheelchair. "Your condition is making our other customers uncomfortable, and we can't have that kind of disruption in an establishment of this caliber. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable eating at home where you won't disturb normal people trying to enjoy their meals." What this arrogant restaurant manager didn't know was that the disabled woman he was publicly humiliating and illegally discriminating against was Dr. Patricia Eleanor Hayes, the newly appointed Federal Commissioner for Disability Rights, armed with the authority to shut down his restaurant and fine him into bankruptcy. And in exactly 24 hours, his comfortable world of ableist discrimination was about to collide with the full force of federal civil rights law. My name is Patricia Hayes, and this is the story of how one evening of blatant discrimination in 1979 became a landmark case that changed accessibility laws for restaurants across America and taught an entire industry that disabled people have rights that cannot be violated with impunity. I was 34 years old and had been paralyzed from the waist down since a car accident in college, but I had never let my wheelchair define my limitations or my possibilities. Most people who met me saw only the disability, never imagining that the woman they were dismissing or pitying held a doctoral degree in civil rights law and had just been appointed by President Carter to lead the nation's efforts to protect disabled Americans from exactly the kind of discrimination I faced every day. Growing up in rural Alabama in the 1950s as a disabled child meant confronting prejudice, ignorance, and systemic exclusion from the moment I was old enough to understand that other people saw my leg braces and crutches before they saw me as a human being. My parents, William and Dorothy Hayes, were school teachers who refused to accept the conventional wisdom that disabled children should be hidden away or institutionalized. "Patricia, sweetheart, God gave you a brilliant mind and a strong spirit," my mother would tell me during the dark moments when cruel children or ignorant adults made me question my worth. "Your legs may not work the way other people's do, but your brain and your heart work better than most. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you're less than whole." The polio that left me partially paralyzed at age 8 was both a tragedy and a teacher, showing me early that the world was not designed for people like me, and that I would have to fight for every opportunity, every accommodation, and every moment of dignity that others took for granted. The stairs without ramps, the bathrooms I couldn't access, the classrooms that had no space for wheelchairs, and the employers who wouldn't hire cripples were daily reminders that American society viewed disabled people as problems to be solved rather than citizens with rights to be protected. The transformation from victim to advocate began during my undergraduate years at the University of Alabama, where I encountered the civil rights movement and understood that the same legal principles being used to fight racial discrimination could be applied to disability discrimination. "Patricia, what you're experiencing is not personal misfortune," explained Professor David Martinez during one of our conversations about civil rights law. "It's systematic oppression that can be challenged through legal action and social change. You have a choice. Accept the limitations others impose on you, or fight to change the system that creates those limitations." The decision to pursue a law degree, despite the additional barriers I would face, was both practical and philosophical, as I realized that legal expertise would give me weapons to fight the discrimination that had shaped every aspect of my life. I want to be the lawyer that disabled people can call when they're denied jobs, kicked out of restaurants, or told they can't live independently, I told my parents when I announced my intention to attend law school. I want to use the law to tear down the barriers that keep us from full participation in American society. The appointment as Federal Commissioner for Disability Rights came after years of advocacy work, legal victories, and the growing recognition that disabled Americans needed someone in government who understood their struggles from personal experience rather than academic theory. Dr. Hayes, your combination of legal expertise and lived experience makes you uniquely qualified to lead our efforts to protect disabled Americans, President Carter had told me during our meeting. You understand both the law and the reality of discrimination in ways that will help us create meaningful change. The evening that changed everything began as a simple dinner celebration with my assistant Jennifer Walsh, and 2 colleagues from the Department of Health and Human Services who had worked on disability rights legislation. We had chosen the Golden Table specifically because it was an upscale restaurant in downtown Washington, D.C., that claimed to be accessible to all patrons in its advertising materials. "Let's see if their actions match their marketing," I had said when we made the reservation, not knowing that I was about to conduct an unintentional field test of their commitment to serving disabled customers. The hostess who greeted us at the entrance seemed flustered by my wheelchair, staring at it as if she had never seen such a device before, and clearly uncertain about how to handle a disabled patron. Do you have a reservation?" she asked hesitantly, her voice suggesting that she was hoping the answer would be no. "Yes, we have a reservation for 4 under the name Hayes," Jennifer replied professionally. "We called ahead to confirm that you could accommodate a wheelchair, and we were assured that wouldn't be a problem." "Well, I don't know about that," the hostess said nervously, glancing around as if looking for someone to handle this unexpected situation. "Let me get the manager. He'll know what to do about this." Her inability to even name my wheelchair or acknowledge me as a customer who deserved basic courtesy was our first indication that the Golden Table's commitment to accessibility was more marketing than reality. Richard Blackwood emerged from the kitchen area with the kind of annoyed expression that suggested he viewed disabled customers as inconvenient problems rather than paying patrons with legal rights. He was a thin, well-dressed man in his 40s, whose entire demeanor radiated the kind of casual ableism that had shaped my entire life. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes focusing on my wheelchair rather than my face, as if the mobility device was somehow separate from the person using it. "No problem at all," I replied cheerfully, determined to give him every opportunity to do the right thing. "We have a reservation for 4, and we're looking forward to trying your famous seafood. I understand you have excellent accessibility features." My positive tone and professional demeanor were calculated to make it easy for him to treat us with basic courtesy and human dignity. Before you continue this powerful story of dignity, legal justice, and the fight for disability rights, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales about people who refuse to accept discrimination and change the world by standing up for equality and human dignity. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we're going to have some issues," Blackwood said, with the kind of false concern that barely masked his hostility. "Your wheelchair is quite large, and we have very narrow aisles between our tables. I'm not sure we can accommodate you without disrupting the dining experience for our other customers. Perhaps you should consider dining somewhere more suitable for people in your situation." His suggestion that I should go elsewhere because my presence might inconvenience other diners was exactly the kind of discrimination that the disability rights movement had been fighting for decades. "Mr. Blackwood, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires restaurants to provide reasonable accommodations for disabled patrons," I said calmly, watching his reaction to being educated about federal law. "I'm sure we can find a table that works for everyone, just as you would for any other customer." "Listen, lady, I don't need lectures about the law from someone who doesn't understand the restaurant business," Blackwood snapped, his professional facade slipping to reveal the prejudice beneath. "This is a high-class establishment that caters to a discerning clientele. We can't have wheelchairs blocking aisles and making other customers uncomfortable. You need to find somewhere else to eat." The illegal discrimination was now explicit and public, occurring in front of witnesses and demonstrating exactly the kind of systematic exclusion that my new federal position was designed to combat. But what made this moment particularly significant was that Blackwood had no idea he was violating federal law in front of the person specifically appointed to enforce those laws. "Sir, what you're describing is illegal discrimination under federal civil rights law," I said clearly, ensuring that everyone in the restaurant could hear my words. "You cannot refuse service to disabled customers based on their disability, and you cannot claim that accommodating us would burden your other patrons. This is exactly the kind of violation that carries serious legal consequences." The fury that erupted from Richard Blackwood when I mentioned legal consequences was immediate and revealing, transforming the restaurant manager from fake professional courtesy to open hostility toward a customer who dared to challenge his discriminatory policies. "Legal consequences?" He laughed mockingly, his voice carrying throughout the dining room where other patrons had stopped eating to watch the confrontation. "Lady, you're nobody special. You're just another disabled person trying to cause trouble where you're not wanted. I've been running restaurants for 20 years, and I know how to handle problem customers like you." His assumption that I was nobody special was about to prove catastrophically wrong, but in that moment, I was more concerned with documenting his discriminatory behavior and protecting the rights of all disabled people who might face similar treatment. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm giving you one final opportunity to seat us like any other customers," I said with the calm authority I had developed through years of legal practice. "Refusing service based on disability is a federal crime, and I strongly advise you to reconsider your position." "Get out," Blackwood snarled, his professional mask completely abandoned. "Get out of my restaurant right now, or I'll call the police and have you removed for trespassing. You people think you can come in here and make demands, but this is a private business, and I have the right to refuse service to anyone I want, especially troublemakers who don't know their place." The other diners in the restaurant were watching with a mixture of shock and discomfort, some clearly appalled by Blackwood's behavior, while others seemed to share his view that disabled people should accept exclusion rather than demanding equal treatment. "This is terrible," whispered an elderly woman at a nearby table. "How can he treat her that way?" But her companion shushed her, apparently believing that witnessing discrimination was less important than avoiding involvement in an uncomfortable situation. Jennifer Walsh, who had been observing the interaction with professional interest, stepped forward with her business card and a calm smile that didn't quite hide her anticipation of what was about to unfold. "Mr. Blackwood, I think you should know that you're speaking to Dr. Patricia Hayes, the Federal Commissioner for Disability Rights," she said clearly. "She was appointed by President Carter specifically to investigate and prosecute cases of disability discrimination. You might want to reconsider your approach to customer service." The silence that followed Jennifer's announcement was electric with tension, as Blackwood processed the information that he had just illegally discriminated against the one person in America with the most power to hold him accountable for such violations. His face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple that suggested panic rather than anger. That's impossible," he stammered. "You're just trying to intimidate me with fake credentials." "I assure you, my credentials are entirely authentic," I replied, pulling out my official identification and federal badge. "And your discrimination against me and other disabled customers is now a matter of official federal investigation. You've violated the civil rights of disabled Americans in front of multiple witnesses, and you've created evidence that will be used to prosecute you and your establishment to the fullest extent of federal law." The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic, as other staff members began to realize that their manager had just committed career suicide while creating legal liability for everyone involved in the discriminatory treatment. "Oh my God," whispered the hostess. "Mr. Blackwood, what have you done?" The other diners were now openly staring, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would likely make headlines and legal history. Blackwood's attempt to salvage the situation was pathetic and far too late, as he suddenly tried to claim that there had been a misunderstanding and that he would be happy to accommodate our party. "Dr. Hayes, please, let me explain," he began desperately. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Of course we can seat you. We pride ourselves on serving all customers. Let me personally ensure you have our best table." "Mr. Blackwood, there was no misunderstanding," I replied firmly. "You clearly and explicitly refused service based on disability, made discriminatory comments about disabled customers, and violated federal civil rights law in front of multiple witnesses. Your sudden change of attitude now that you know my identity only demonstrates that your discrimination was intentional and systematic rather than accidental." The documentation process that followed was thorough and professional, as Jennifer recorded testimony from witnesses while I gathered evidence of the restaurant's discriminatory policies and practices. Several other diners came forward to report that they had seen disabled customers turned away in the past, creating a pattern of illegal behavior that would strengthen our federal case. I brought my brother here last month, and they wouldn't seat him because he uses a walker, reported Mrs. Catherine Martinez, an elderly customer who had been dining at a corner table. They said it was a safety hazard and suggested he order takeout instead. I was so embarrassed for him, but I didn't know there was anything we could do about it. Her testimony provided crucial evidence that the discrimination I had experienced was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of illegal exclusion. The federal investigation that began immediately was swift and comprehensive, as Department of Justice attorneys armed with federal subpoenas descended on the Golden Table to examine their policies, training materials, and historical treatment of disabled customers. Dr. Hayes, your case has provided us with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that disability discrimination will not be tolerated in American businesses, explained Assistant Attorney General Sarah Thompson. We're going to make this restaurant a poster child for the consequences of violating federal civil rights law. The media coverage that followed was extensive and generally supportive, as newspapers and television stations covered the story of the Federal Disability Rights Commissioner who had been illegally discriminated against while conducting unofficial oversight of accessibility compliance. Federal official faces restaurant discrimination, read the headline in the Washington Post. Commissioner's experience highlights ongoing bias against disabled Americans, announced the New York Times. The legal proceedings that unfolded were complex and precedent-setting, as federal prosecutors used my case to establish new standards for accessibility compliance and penalties for discrimination in the restaurant industry. The Golden Table case represents a watershed moment in disability rights enforcement, legal scholars would later write. It demonstrated that businesses could no longer violate federal law with impunity, regardless of their size or social status. The settlement negotiations that followed were intense and comprehensive, as Blackwood and his investors faced potential bankruptcy from federal fines, legal costs, and court-ordered accessibility improvements. We're looking at millions of dollars in penalties, plus the cost of making their restaurant fully accessible, plus ongoing monitoring by federal officials, their attorney explained during one of the settlement conferences. Your client's discrimination is going to cost him everything he's built. The personal satisfaction I felt watching Blackwood squirm under federal investigation was tempered by the knowledge that his illegal behavior represented attitudes and practices that affected millions of disabled Americans every day. This isn't about revenge, I explained to reporters who asked about my motivations. This is about establishing the principle that disabled people have the same rights as everyone else, and that violating those rights carries serious consequences. The changes that the Golden Table was forced to implement went far beyond basic accessibility compliance, including staff training programs, policy revisions, and ongoing monitoring by federal disability rights officials. We're going to turn this restaurant into a model of accessibility and inclusion, I announced during the press conference that followed the settlement agreement. Other businesses will see what happens when you discriminate against disabled customers, and they'll understand that compliance is not optional. The transformation of the Golden Table from a bastion of disability discrimination to a model of accessibility compliance was both swift and comprehensive, as federal oversight and media attention forced fundamental changes in their policies, procedures, and attitudes toward disabled customers. Within 6 months, the restaurant had installed ramps, widened doorways, modified restrooms, trained all staff in disability awareness, and established protocols that ensured disabled patrons received the same quality service as all other customers. Dr. Hayes, I want to personally apologize for my behavior and thank you for giving us the opportunity to become better, Richard Blackwood said during the restaurant's grand reopening ceremony, his humility apparently genuine after months of federal investigation and legal proceedings. Your experience taught us that accessibility isn't just about following the law, it's about treating all people with dignity and respect. We're proud to be leaders in inclusive dining now. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond one restaurant, as businesses across the country began reviewing their accessibility policies and practices in response to the precedent established by federal prosecution of disability discrimination. The Golden Table case sent a clear message that the federal government takes disability rights seriously, explained civil rights attorney Michael Rodriguez. Restaurants, hotels, and retail establishments everywhere realized that discriminating against disabled customers could result in federal prosecution and bankruptcy-level fines. The speaking engagements I began accepting at business conferences and industry associations allowed me to educate employers and service providers about both the legal requirements and the moral imperatives of treating disabled people as equal participants in American society. Accessibility isn't just good law, it's good business, I would tell audiences of restaurant owners and hospitality professionals. Disabled Americans represent a market of over 40 million consumers with billions of dollars in spending power. When you exclude us, you're not just violating our rights, you're losing customers and revenue. The legislative changes that followed the case included stronger enforcement mechanisms for disability rights laws and increased penalties for businesses that engaged in discriminatory practices. Dr. Hayes' experience demonstrated gaps in our enforcement capabilities that needed to be addressed, explained Congressman James Wilson, who sponsored the Disability Rights Enforcement Act of 1980. We've strengthened the law to ensure that federal officials have the tools they need to protect disabled Americans from discrimination. The mentoring work I began doing with young disabled lawyers and advocates became one of the most rewarding aspects of my career, as I helped others understand that they could use their experiences with discrimination as motivation for creating systemic change. Your disability is not a limitation. It's a perspective that can help you understand injustice in ways that others might miss, I would tell young advocates. Use that understanding to fight for people who don't have the education, resources, or platform to fight for themselves. The marriage to Robert Chen, a disability rights attorney who had worked on accessibility legislation, represented both personal happiness and professional partnership in our shared commitment to advancing civil rights for disabled Americans. Patricia, you've shown me that love isn't about finding someone who doesn't see your disability, Robert said during his wedding vows. It's about finding someone who sees your strength, your intelligence, and your passion for justice, and loves you for all of those things. The children we adopted, 2 siblings who had been born with disabilities and faced discrimination in the foster care system, grew up understanding both their rights and their responsibilities as disabled Americans. Mom, why did that restaurant manager think he could treat you badly just because you use a wheelchair? Our daughter asked when she was old enough to understand the story. Because some people are taught that disabled people are less valuable than others, I explained. But they're wrong, and it's our job to prove that to them. The Federal Disability Rights Commission that I led for 12 years became the most effective civil rights enforcement agency in the government, successfully prosecuting thousands of discrimination cases and establishing legal precedents that protected disabled Americans in employment, education, housing, and public accommodations. Commissioner Hayes transformed disability rights from a niche legal issue into a mainstream civil rights priority, wrote legal historians who studied the period. Her leadership changed how America thinks about disability and accessibility. The nonprofit organization I founded after leaving government service, the Hayes Institute for Disability Justice, became a leading voice in advocating for stronger civil rights protections and better enforcement of existing laws. Dr. Hayes' work has literally changed millions of lives, wrote the president of the National Disability Rights Coalition. Her courage in standing up to discrimination and her skill in using the law to create change have made America a more inclusive society for all disabled people. The university programs I helped establish for training disability rights lawyers provided a new generation of advocates with the skills and knowledge needed to continue the fight for equality and inclusion. Professor Hayes taught us that law is not just about rules and regulations, said one of my former students who became a federal judge. It's about using those rules to protect people who need protection and to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to participate fully in American life. The recognition I received, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom and honorary doctorates from dozens of universities, was gratifying but secondary to the knowledge that my work had opened doors for millions of disabled Americans who would never face the kind of discrimination I had experienced. Awards are nice, but real success is measured by the disabled children who grow up expecting equality rather than accepting exclusion, I said during my acceptance speech for the Medal of Freedom. The retirement years I've spent writing and speaking about disability rights have allowed me to reflect on how much has changed since that evening at the Golden Table and how much work still remains to be done. We've made tremendous progress in the 40 years since my restaurant experience, I often tell audiences. But every time a disabled person is denied a job, excluded from a building, or treated as less than equal, we're reminded that the fight for civil rights is never finished. Looking back on that confrontation in 1979, I understand that Richard Blackwood's discrimination was both a personal insult and a professional opportunity, giving me the evidence I needed to demonstrate that disability discrimination was real, pervasive, and illegal. His assumption that I was nobody special became the foundation for legal precedents that protected millions of people he would never meet. The restaurant manager who thought he could humiliate a disabled woman with impunity learned that some people have the power to turn personal discrimination into systemic change. His illegal behavior became the catalyst for laws, policies, and cultural changes that made America more accessible and inclusive for all disabled people. The federal commissioner who was refused service at the Golden Table used that discrimination to educate an entire industry about disability rights and to establish legal precedents that continue to protect disabled Americans today. Sometimes the most important victories come from moments when people reveal their true character, both their prejudices and their strength. The legacy of that evening lives on in accessible restaurants across America, in stronger civil rights laws, in changed attitudes about disability and inclusion, and in the understanding that disabled people are not problems to be solved, but citizens with rights to be protected. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept discrimination, even when, especially when, you're the only person in the room with the power to stop it.